Memorial Medical Center, their work with the SIU School of Medicine, this Innovation Center really breathes life into our commitment to the very best in healthcare. We're lucky to live in the United States, all of us, for many, many reasons, not the least of which is the quality healthcare which we can offer to so many people. And Memorial Medical Center and SIU School of Medicine have made that promise a reality for hundreds, if not thousands of people. Dr. Dolan, you're going to be up next. You're welcome to join me here in the camera shot if you dare, and then comment on this issue. So the big question that I was asked this morning was, if you weren't talking about a wall in Washington, what would you be talking about? And I think that's a legitimate question. We seem to be focused on one issue that the president has raised and one appropriation bill. And the question is, if and when you ever resolve it, and I hope that's soon, what will be next? Well, I want to suggest a topic that should be next: the cost of prescription drugs in the United States of America. 95 years ago, researchers were awarded the Nobel Prize for a groundbreaking discovery: the use of insulin for patients with diabetes. The researchers sold the patent and license terms for insulin to the University of Toronto. They sold it in 1923 for $1. They did so because they believed insulin should be made widely available to everyone without worrying about cost and price competition. That might seem hard to believe today, 95 years later, where the price of insulin has doubled between 2012 and 2016. Lantus, a popular long-acting insulin, cost $88 for each vial in 2007. Today, the cost per vial, $310. How can a drug that's been on the market for nearly a century see such dramatic price increases? And what is the government doing, if anything, about it? A problem is that our system for medications does not function as a free market. There are too many forces at work that limit competition. Often, Big Pharma charges as much as they can get away with because they are protected by government-granted monopolies. I firmly believe in this innovation center that we should reward innovation. We should promote research and ensure companies can earn a profit for good work. But abusive drug manufacturers should not be protected by our government. Unfortunately, there is no effective deterrent today against Big Pharma and the price gouging that we're seeing in so many drugs. That's why I've introduced a bill in Washington which will prevent large price spikes in prescription drugs. Whether the overnight price spikes come at the hands of Martin, his name's Shkreli, infamous Martin Shkreli, or the year-over-year increases for insulin, we have to stop this. My bill, forcing limits on abusive prices, the Flat Prices Act, will deter pharma's price hikes by reducing government-issued monopoly periods when they raise the prices. You see, drug companies are awarded monopoly periods of 5 to 12 years by the Food and Drug Administration for new drugs. That's beyond their patent protection. During this time, FDA agrees not to review cheaper generic alternatives. That means the drug manufacturer can charge whatever they want during this period without competition. My Flat Prices Act would reduce this FDA-granted exclusivity period for a drug whose price increases more than 10% a year, similar increases over multi-year periods. Take Pfizer's drug for nerve pain, Lyrica. We've all seen the ads. Since President Trump took office, the price of Lyrica has increased by more than 30%. It now costs $550 a month. Through Medicare, American taxpayers are spending more than $2 billion a year for the drug. That's a figure from 2016. And because it's been granted market exclusivity by the FDA through November 2021, Pfizer increases the price anytime they wish. It wouldn't happen under this bill that I'm proposing. If my bill becomes law, Pfizer would no longer enjoy a lengthy monopoly period and instead face new competition from lower-cost generic drug sooners. And I've got news for Big Pharma. Today's legislation is just the tip of the spear. Last year, one of my bills passed the Senate. It's a simple bill, and it addresses something that you may have noticed lately. Have you seen any ads for drugs on television? How about $6 billion worth each year? Turns out that most of us see ads for drugs 8 or 9 times a day. Older folks, I'm sure, even more. Why? Why all this direct-to-consumer advertising? Why is the United States of America the only country on earth except New Zealand that allows this to happen, for drug companies to advertise on television? They are advertising in the hopes that the viewer will finally reach the point where they can spell Xarelto and go to the doctor and say, I need it, when it comes to a blood thinner. Of course, Xarelto is dramatically more expensive than the alternatives, and most doctors with limited time to see a patient don't want to get into a debate about whether this drug that has been promoted on television is better than warfarin or some other drug, and so they prescribe it. And by prescribing the more expensive blood thinner, even when it may not be medically indicated, the doctor is finished with that patient and the price of health care keeps going up. Blue Cross Blue Shield says that the cost of prescription drugs is the #1 price driver in the increase in premiums that we're seeing each year in health insurance. It is a very big deal. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa and I team up to do things. We're obviously the political odd couple, conservative Republican from Iowa and myself. We worked on criminal justice reform. He and I have a bill that's pretty simple. It just requires Pharma, during those television ads where they're jabbering information at you so fast you can't even absorb it. If you're allergic to Humira, don't take Humira. I love that. We're going to say, take about a split second in there and tell us what the cost of that drug is, post it on the screen. It'll be a good way for us to see the dramatic cost increases in drugs like Humira, and for us to track them when they increase these costs in the future. So we're working on this and many other issues, and you'll be surprised, I'm a little surprised to even report this to you, that a couple of these ideas that I've come up with, one of them posting the drug prices on television, and another one saying that if the drug company offers a discount to any country, they've got to offer the same discount in the United States. Actually, I'm working with the Trump administration on those 2 provisions. They have an interest in this as well. So this is something that most Americans identify as a major challenge, and it's something we should address once we get beyond the wall. Dr. Dolan?
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And as Mr. Curtis mentioned, I've had the good fortune to practice medicine in this area for nearly 30 years. That is many, many hours of listening, diagnosing, and planning with these young people and families. I often end that planning time saying, does that sound doable? Does this sound simple enough that you can work this into your life? And now I need to add, is it affordable? And most of the time, families don't know. They walk with anxiety to the pharmacy counter and are informed of what money they need so their children can have the medicines we've discussed. Sometimes they're life-saving medicines, EpiPens, insulin. Just as often, they're making just routine pharmacy trips, picking up medicines that they've budgeted for, that they've perhaps taken for months or years, and then they have a sudden surprise of a new cash total. There goes the money they budgeted for rent, for groceries, for daycare. When the cost keeps them from filling a prescription, doctors often don't know. This is an embarrassing predicament for these families. This embarrassing secret then can lead to poor choices when we're managing medications. Medicines that I assume are not working were not given because they couldn't afford it. There was just not enough money left in their wallet or their credit card balance. I recently learned of a Facebook page from one of my patients with type 1 diabetes. Beyond the valuable management that this Facebook page gives for this very complex disease, the site actually allows families who have the good fortune to have their insulin dose reduced to share some of their excess insulin with those who need more of this extravagantly priced medicine, or those where their dose has gone up above their ability to pay. Insulin is a primary cost for diabetic care, but not the only one. One of my families with type 1 diabetes told me in the last 2 years since she was diagnosed, they spend $10,000 a year, and they have good insurance. I applaud this bill, and the hope that it offers to improve this dire situation. Thank you for letting me speak on behalf of Memorial Health System.
Thanks, Dr. Dolan. That's great. I'll just close with a story that kind of parallels what Dr. Dolan told. In Minnesota, my colleague Amy Klobuchar told the story of a young man named Alex who was the manager of a restaurant, diabetic, taking insulin, covered by his mom and dad's health insurance, and then reached the age of 26, where he was no longer covered by their health insurance and didn't have health insurance that paid for his insulin. The cost went up so dramatically that he decided to start limiting the dosage instead of what was prescribed. Eventually he died from that decision. And it's an indication of an area where cost reaches a point where it literally is a matter of your money or your life. And he gave his life because he didn't have the money to pay for the drug that was discovered 95 years ago. Answer any questions.
How would it work in that it's not a monopoly on all drugs you restrict? What figures the apply to that?
If you have a new drug, you get a patent period of time that is your exclusive period to sell. Then we give, by a decision 20 years ago or so, we give in a longer period, a new period of exclusivity depending on the drug of 5 to 12 years. And that has been given by the government beyond the patent. What we're saying is during that period of exclusivity, if the price goes up more than 10% a year, 18% over 2 years and such, then we start reducing that period of exclusivity. You're going to pay for that price increase by having fewer years of a monopoly control of the drug.
Senator, I have heard conversation, I don't know how true it is or not, but that because other nations put a price cap on what drugs can be sold at, it's the American consumer that bears all the cost of research and development, even though these drugs save lives around the world.
That is exactly the case. And it just seems to me incredible that you can cross that border, which many times is not even visible, between the United States and Canada, and find the drugs manufactured in the United States, for sale in the United States, advertised in the United States, dramatically cheaper in Canada than the United States. Why? Because the Canadian government says so. The Canadian government steps in and says, we won't allow you to increase the cost of these drugs if you want to be part of the Canadian health system. We should do the same thing for Medicare. We do it for the Veterans Administration. We should do it for Medicare.
Can I ask you, should we ask these other nations to say, maybe you all should pay a little bit more?
No.
So that we
No.
don't have to pay more?
No.
Or, and if we don't do that, then if we don't do that, do we inhibit the development of future drugs? That's what we will hear from the pharmaceutical companies.
Pharmaceutical companies, of course, will say that. What they won't tell you is they spend more money in marketing than they do in research. We're for innovation, and innovation should be rewarded when it's successful with higher profits for those pharmaceutical companies. But there comes a limit. There comes a time when you have to say enough is enough. And when they start taking a drug which there is no risk involved in insulin, remember, the patent was given to us. They take that drug and start raising that price. For goodness sakes, we have the right to ask why and how are you doing this? You know, from my point of view, telling other countries around the world you just have to pay more begs the question. If these pharmaceutical companies were just struggling along, it would be one thing, but they're extremely profitable.
Do you expect Super Bowl Sunday? I know neither of us probably have a commercial list, but do you expect Super Bowl Sunday to be a bath of, or a great example of, I think I remember a few pharmaceutical commercials in the mix last year that paying for the most expensive commercials available all the entire year.
I don't think so. I'm just guessing, but most of the marketing you find, it comes at the time of day when seniors are watching. You know, that's their target audience by and large, because, you know, a senior hears this ad that gives them some hope that they can deal with one of their challenges, a new name, and as I said, they struggle, they finally write it down and get it close to being right, and off they go to the doctors. They're not the only ones by any means, but I think that's their target audience. I think the Super Bowl ads may be beyond their target audience.
How much would you want to reduce this government granted monopoly period by?
It depends on the drug. If they are going to increase the prices, we give different periods of exclusivity, 5 years to 12 years, depending on the drug. Biologics are longer, but it depends on the drug. If they have a 5-year period of exclusivity and they start raising the price during that 5-year period, it's reduced to 4.5 years and 4 years, and pretty soon they lose their monopoly power altogether.
Isn't making the most money possible the American way?
Well, it is, except when you're penalizing average people who are just trying to maintain their own health and the health of their children. I think we need to draw a line here in terms of what is acceptable. And at this point, Pharma is, I hope you've seen it. We sure seen it in Washington, D.C. As soon as I set foot in that area, we are inundated with ads about any regulation of Pharma. Pharma enjoys this unique political position that it's been a kind of a hands-off operation from the political point of view for a long period of time. I can explain to you some of the history of it, but they've ingratiated themselves to both political parties. They are very generous givers to political campaigns for both political parties, with the understanding that neither political party will call them into question or challenge them about their pricing. It's time for that party to end.
Senator, on
Hospital.
that point, how likely is your bill going to pass when Pharma has such influence? And to what extent, because President Trump, as you say, you're working with the administration, has also complained about Pharma pricing. To what extent, because he's helping, might your bill go through?
That's why I have some hope. When I did the criminal justice reform bill, Senator Grassley and I, Democrats, Republicans, House and Senate, really it wasn't until President Trump called a press conference and said, I'll sign the bill, that we knew we had a chance to actually make a law. Now he said he's kind of stuck on one of his campaign promises, but in the course of his campaign, he said he wanted to deal with drug pricing. I think he's serious. Secretary Azar from HHS called me. I didn't vote for Secretary Azar's confirmation, but we've been working together, and I have to give credit to him. It's been a very positive and constructive conversation. They're catching the heat from Pharma too. Pharma's come down on the Trump administration. So if the president sticks with that campaign promise and backs up the bills which I'm working on with the administration, I think we get a chance to do this. I'm kind of a little surprised to say it, but I think that's true.
I know a few blocks away, we're going to see Vibra Hospital close long-term for-profit hospital. I know pharmaceuticals weren't directly cited, but do you think that's part of the pressure and maybe a sign of things to come with these costs continuing to spiral upwards?
Well, I'll defer to Ed Curtis, the expert on running hospitals, as to what kind of costs they're running into. But I can just tell you, when Blue Cross Blue Shield identifies the rising uncontrollable cost of prescription drugs as the #1 driver on health insurance premiums, I'm sure it's something that hospitals have to reckon with as well.
This might be a question for someone else, but do you know how many people in Illinois, is there any data for that, of how many people have trouble paying for these medications?
How many people have what?
Have trouble paying for their medications?
That I don't know. Not off the top of my head.
If we're able to ask, if we're done with that, you're one of the negotiators trying to avert the next shutdown, assuming that's what you want. Can you give an update on where that stands?
We had our first meeting of this conference committee. There are 17 of us, House and Senate, Democrat, Republican, and it's familiar territory. I've been on Appropriations Committee in the House and Senate for a long, long time, and I know most of the players at the table, and I know how this works. This is what we do. We are given a target in terms of how much money we can spend, and we try to work out our differences. Now, there occasionally comes along something we call a poison pill, an issue that we think we can't resolve, that is too divisive, and we kick that upstairs to the leadership to make a decision on what we're going to do on a poison pill issue. Well, the issue that will be kicked upstairs is clearly how much money will be spent on fences, barriers, and a wall, because I don't think there's likely to be an agreement within the conference committee. We can agree on many things, on most things that are included in that bill, probably not on that single one thing. For the record, we have 650 miles of fences, barriers, and walls between the United States and Mexico. Already 650, built under presidents of both political parties. We approved for this president in his first 2 years in office an additional 124 miles of fences, barriers, and walls. How much has been built so far? None. It takes a long time. You've got to get the land, you've got to get the rights of way, you've got to put in an access road, you've got to let a contract, competitive bidding, on and on. So whatever the president gets, whatever it happens to be in this debate, is not likely to even be seen before the next election. But the question is, what do we need? How much do we need from this point going forward? Many of us believe that there are other issues on the border which are equally or more important than a wall. The president's vision on a wall has changed so many times, I just defy anybody to describe what he means when he says the word. At one point it was a concrete wall from sea to shining sea, and the Mexicans would pay for it. The next time around it's steel slatted barriers, and then it's vehicle barriers, and on, kind of redefining the issue on a regular basis. But we can keep this border safe and do it at much less cost. I'll just say this last word, when the president asked for this year's appropriation bill and the increases in fences and barriers, he asked us to increase last year's expenditure of $1.3 billion to $1.6 billion. That's about a 20% increase. In the world of Washington, that's a pretty healthy increase, 20%. In the last few weeks, he's increased the ask to $5.7 billion, a 300% increase over last year. And we're saying, where are you going to spend it? What's your plan? I think that's our responsibility to taxpayers, to be specific.
Do you
You
have
guys
a number
supported-
that you could land on
I-
in between?
I could come up with a number that would sound right to me, but that's not the important thing. It's the number that sounds right to the leaders
You
and to
wanna
the
say the
president.
number that sounds
No,
right to you?
no.
If Democrats supported and gave the president money for a wall previously, why is it now immoral?
It's,
all of a sudden?
well, I can just tell you that there are expenditures which we can rationalize. The 20% increase is one of them, but to go up 300%, to me, that figure just grabbed out of thin air. It really doesn't bear any relationship to what we really need at the border. Example, we are in the midst of the worst drug epidemic in the history of the United States, bar none. Opioid, heroin, fentanyl, it's everywhere. It used to be an inner city problem, it's everybody's problem. It's small town America, it's suburbs, it's everybody's problem. Where is this coming from? How are these narcotics getting into the United States? 90% of those coming into the United States are coming through ports of entry on our border with Mexico, not with people in backpacks scaling a wall. They're coming through in trucks and cars. What percentage of trucks and cars do we scan or x-ray coming into this country to try to discover drugs, weapons, people? 18%. Fewer than 1 out of 5 cars and trucks. So the president, I suggested it, he added it, we all believe, we need to put hundreds of millions of dollars into scanners to stop, at least slow down, if not stop, the flow of narcotics into this country. You want a bipartisan issue that is a border security issue that everybody cheers for? That's one of them.
Republicans are saying that they're compromising. The president said he's compromised, including DACA, 3-year extension there, and so on. Where are the Democrats compromising?
I can tell you that we have agreed to many of the president's issues. The one obviously divisive issue is the amount of money to be spent on the wall.
It seems like half of your colleagues on the Democratic side are running for president. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, a few others. Do you have a preference, or what are you
No.
looking for in the Democratic nominee?
No, I jumped early on one presidential campaign for a colleague of mine in the United States Senate. At this point, I think as of today, 4 or 5 of my colleagues are running. Wonderful people. Each one brings something, I think, important to the race. And ultimately, the voters in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, Nevada, and so forth are going to sort this out and pick the person they think is the best to be the Democratic nominee. Before it's all over, we could have a pretty large stage to have all the candidates out
Do
there.
they need to be a moderate person, or a person on the left?
They need to be a person who can win and move this country forward and turn it around from some of the disastrous decisions that are currently being made.
Senator, on decisions being made, Secretary of State Pompeo today is going to be proposing to withdraw the United States from the INF Treaty of Interrange Nuclear Weapons, saying China's not a part of the treaty and Russia's violating it. Do you have an opinion on it?
I think we need to do that extremely carefully. In the past, when presidents disagreed with the leaders in Russia over this issue, they ended up in long, serious negotiations before we walked away. This president doesn't operate that way. He announces tariffs on products overnight. He announces that we're going to get out of the Iran nuclear agreement in a matter of days and weeks. I don't think that that's in the best interest of the security of the United States. If the Russians are violating the treaty, we should call them on it. But we should try to negotiate a peaceful resolution to it that doesn't leave us in a position where we've walked away from the bargaining table.
The state began a program of making medical marijuana an alternative.
Just a second, please.
State of the Union is coming up on February 5th. Do you have any comments regarding that?
Well, I'm glad that we're not in a government shutdown. After a 35-day shutdown by this president, I'm glad that he finally came to his senses, and I want to thank my Republican Senate colleagues the most because they said they'd had enough of it. They were fed up with it. I think at the breaking point when it came to that shutdown was when the air traffic controllers announced last Friday that they were going to have to slow down air operations, landing and takeoff on the East Coast. That, to me, was a kind of a grim reminder that these men and women are doing important life-saving work in keeping us safe on airlines. I hope the President, despite his threats, does not return to that.
The state medical marijuana program started yesterday where, as far as the aspect of serving as a potential opioid replacement pilot project, Illinois, I understand, is the first. Will Washington be watching how that progress moves along?
I could give a long speech, and I won't, on this whole issue of marijuana. I can remember the worst times when it came to marijuana, and when I was a lawyer in this town, and somebody with a 17-year-old son would come in and say, my kid just got busted for smoking pot. Those families would discover for the first time something called the Bill of Rights and Miranda warnings. They want to know all about it, and whether or not there was any way to spare their son from the embarrassment and possibly life-changing results of being prosecuted for smoking a joint. I represented families like that, and I thought that was the extreme when it came to marijuana. Now we've got to take care that we don't go to the other extreme. We've got to be careful in terms of the development of marijuana. We have to start with the premise that because of the conflict between state and federal laws, we have not tested marijuana, THC, in a way we test drugs that are used commonly, make sure they're safe and effective. We have some evidence, some clinical evidence, but by and large anecdotal evidence about the effectiveness of marijuana. And I've said I'm for medical marijuana because I wouldn't preclude any chemical that might have some life-saving quality to it if it's prescribed. So now comes the question, can we move from opioids to some form of medical marijuana for pain relief and not have the same kind of addiction that results today with opioids? I'm open to that. After I see the devastation of opioids, I'm looking for that, realizing we definitely need to have pain relief for many people. But I think what's missing here is the usual course of clinical trials that really give us an assurance that if it is used for this purpose, it will have that impact. And so let me recommend something for you to read. Malcolm Gladwell, you may know the name, pretty famous author. I think I've read all his books. He had an article in the New Yorker 2 weeks ago called Unwatched Pot, in which he talks about the impact of legalizing marijuana in many states around the nation and what they have seen as a result of it. The increase in traffic accidents, certain mental health conditions seem to be more prevalent in those states. I mean, these are all legitimate clinical questions that should be asked and tested. I am not ruling this out, but I stand here as a politician and not as an expert on which drug is appropriate for pain relief.
So you're telling Governor Pritzker and our legislature to go slow on legalization
Well,
of recreational use?
I'm not, they don't usually call me for advice, Bernie. But I did send the article to Andy Minar, and Andy read it, and I sent an article to him that rebutted it, so he'd see both sides of the argument. And he said he took a close look before his town meeting. Because I want to get this right. Moving from medical marijuana to recreational marijuana really is just filled with challenges. How do you measure impairment of driving in vehicles? How do you measure impairment on the job for people that are using heavy equipment and machinery that could be dangerous? I mean, these sorts of things are legitimate questions. We had possibly good answers when it came to alcohol, but when it comes to marijuana, I think we're in new territory.
Should we open up the scheduling of cannabis? I mean, you're talking about looking at medical uses for it and testing and whatnot. I mean, that seems to be the big impediment is scheduling of it.
Yeah, the schedule, you're right. And as long as we keep it in a schedule where it's considered a narcotic, it's going to preclude the kind of research that we need to answer these medical questions. I think that's a mistake. Many of us, despite the scheduling, think that the research should go forward through the FDA.
Can I ask one quick questions about the partial government shutdown? Now we're open for 3 weeks. What do you anticipate to happen on February 15th?
I think if the president tries this again, tries another shutdown, I think he's in for a rude awakening. I don't think the Republicans in Congress will support him.
What about a national emergency?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and it's interesting how many the president has said, if Congress doesn't give me what I want when it comes to a wall and border security, I will exercise my authority under emergency powers of the executive. Now, there are emergency powers of the executive, but they're very few, they're very well defined, and they're seldom used. The only time I've ever seen it was after 9/11. President George W. Bush said, I've got an emergency here, I want to move on some military installations immediately after 9/11. We had a consensus immediately. Democrats and Republicans, do it. This is a national emergency. We agree with you, Mr. President. Now comes President Trump, and what I think is a largely manufactured border crisis, says he wants to use these emergency powers. Well, now some conservative Republican senators are saying, wait a minute, if he can use these emergency powers for his view of border security, some Democratic president can use those emergency powers for their view of climate change. And so they're kind of backing off a second, saying, take a deep breath. Before you give any president that kind of power, summary power, over the decision-making process, be careful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Doctor. Thanks, Senator. 30 years.